But whatever it calls itself, Nazism, Marxist-Leninism, today terrorism, ils ont tous un point commun. They all have one thing in common: the destruction, the end of human liberty. My fear is this: as we move further into the 21st century, Canadians, especially new Canadians, new generations, will forget or will not be taught the lessons hard learned and the victories hard earned over the last 100 years. That they will fall even further in love with ease and convenience. What history has taught us is one clear thing: that the political ideologies that promise utopia lead to the opposite, hell on earth. That's why Canada needs this monument, and why we are so grateful to the work of Tribute to Liberty that reminds us of the names and the stories of those lost to one of the deadliest ideological plagues ever spread, to communism.
Prime Minister Stephen Harper on communism's horrific legacy. He was commenting on Canada's effort to remember those who lost their lives fighting for freedom. Well, in the U.S., the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation also awards a medal to those who committed their lives to democracy and freedom. On June 11th, the foundation awarded the Truman Reagan Medal of Freedom to two Ukrainian leaders who fought against Soviet rule. They are Mustafa Dzhemilev, he spent decades defending the rights of Crimean Tatars, and Miroslav Marinovich, founder of Amnesty International Ukraine. Well, joining us now from Washington is Marion Smith, Executive Director of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Welcome to the show, Mr. Smith. I think that communism is not yet fully put into its proper place. I mean, after the Second World War, we had denazification of Germany, and every schoolboy was taught that Nazism was evil. But after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Marxism and communism were not so denounced. In fact, they just took up residence in Western universities. Am I right?
Well, unfortunately, in 1989, Soviet communism collapsed in Europe, but it lived elsewhere. And now we see here, 25 years after the fall of the Iron Curtain, that we're still dealing with the toxic legacy of communism in Europe, in the former Soviet space where we thought it was long gone. And yes, you're right. Unfortunately, there has been a successful effort in the West to largely disassociate the ideas of communism from the consequences of communism every single time it's been tried.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and part of it, I think, is not wanting to offend China, this great economic light that everyone wants to trade with. I mean, I certainly hear that in Canada. Oh, don't denounce communism. But you heard a speech there. Our Prime Minister was talking about the evils of communism. We're starting a monument in Canada. It's not even built yet. I mean, that's how tepid the Canadian effort is, but still it's better than most. And even that, all the foreign policy mandarins said, oh, don't do that. You'll upset the Chinese. What about speaking clarity and truth to evil?
That's exactly right. Communism is alive and well. It exists in 5 countries today. Roughly 20% of the world's population, or 1.5 billion people, live in a form of communist regime. And yes, in China as well. It's the 25th anniversary of the massacre in Tiananmen Square this year. And despite some economic reforms that have taken place in China, the power structure in China remains unchanged since 1990. It remains an authoritarian state ruled by the Communist Party. Mm-hmm. There has been improvement, but there is still tyranny in China. And it takes moral courage to see it and call it that way.
Well, what I don't understand is the moral and philosophical acrobatics used by those in America and Canada to say, well, you know, Marxism is beautiful in theory, and we should have entire college departments dedicated to it, and we should honor these Marxist scholars. The only problem was in its implementation. They broke a few too many eggs when they make that omelet. I mean, how, if we had a professor about theoretical Nazism and said, oh, yeah, Hitler just got too caught up with that whole Jew thing. I mean, people would say, you're nuts, you're crazy, you're outside the beyond the pale. Why have we allowed people who, frankly, some of them still long for the glory days of Stalin and Mao, why have we allowed them to have a place of prominence and respect in our academic community?
Well, the historical record is clear. Communism is an enabling ideology for tyranny, and it has been the most deadly ideology of the last century. More than 100 million people killed by communist regimes since 1917. It hasn't worked anywhere. It promises peace, prosperity, and equality, and it has delivered poverty and destitution and death and suffering, and as it turns out, no equality, because there is in every communist country an elite that holds the power and governs over the rest.
Marion Smith, give us one last word. Do you think that you are breaking through into the mainstream media? Your award, I have to tell you, even I had not heard about it until most recently. Do you get a lot of coverage for what you're doing, or is there still sort of a silencing of even any discussion of anti-communism? Are you called a McCarthyist? Are you called a hothead or a reactionary instead of someone who remembers history? Last word to you.
Well, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation is very fortunate to have an authorizing act by Congress 20 years ago that was passed unanimously, signed into law by President Bill Clinton, of course a Democrat. Our monument, erected 8 years ago in Washington, D.C., was dedicated by President George W. Bush at our recent events this past week, where we gave the Truman Reagan Medal of Freedom to Miroslav Mironovich and announced it for Mustafa Zhemilev. We had bipartisan speakers in the House and the Senate. So Americans have always had a sort of unifying rallying cry against communism. And we have to make sure that it stays that way, because it is an ideology, it is a system of government that is at odds with the rule of law, democratic self-government, and all that Western democracy has stood for.
Thank you, Mr. Smith, for joining us today. I appreciate your work.